from Pretoria. Is everything all right? People talk, say things.
Hello?
Why didn't you tell me it was out of order? I suppose you think that's funny.
I'm not allowed out the front door.
Who says you weren't?
Them.
Who?
Them.
It was terrible out there. I could hear breathing.
We told you.
Are you worried about the man?
They hate us. That's the truth. They want to kill and torture every one of us. You can see it in their eyes.
Come now, Frederick. Do you dream about unholy things?
I really don't like what's going on here. There's something wrong, and that's a fact.
Wait. What did you dream last night? This manifestation of evil. You must be delivered from evil.
Although edited for television, tonight's thriller contains scenes of suspense and violence which may be unsuitable for young viewers. Parental discretion is advised.
Observations with Robert Meyer Burnett.
Well, greetings, imagination connoisseurs. Once again, it is I, your Duke of Dope Discourse, your master of fun and wonder, your viceroy of verisimilitude, your sommelier of sci-fi and cinema, your evangelist of the imagination, and of course, the perhaps never to be defined existential Mr. Rogers. That's right, me, Robert Meyer Burnett, and I'm Robcasting from right here in the Rob Observatory. You imagination connoisseurs, you members of this, the Post-Geek Singularity community. This is Robservations episode number 1060. Well, folks, once again, the year has come around full circle. It is September 8th, 2025, Star Trek Day. It is the 59th anniversary of Star Trek's debut on television with the episode The Man Trap, which was not the pilot of the show. That didn't air till the third episode, which, of course, was Star Trek's second pilot, Where No Man Has Gone Before. And then, of course, the first pilot, The Cage, which canonically was used as part of the two-part episode, the only two-part TOS episode, The Menagerie, later on in the season, establishing Star Trek canon in a very interesting way. The Menagerie, and specifically The Cage, has probably become, for a rejected episode of Star Trek that the network said no to, but they did incorporate it in a fascinating way, has become the basis for basically all of modern Star Trek. Not Star Trek TOS proper, but its rejected pilot, The Cage, which is fascinating. Someone needs to write an article or do some analysis about why that is. I suspect it is because people looked at that episode and said, wow, there's what fertile territory, this Captain Pike. What if we went back and examined those stories? Of course, there was a great Marvel Comics in the 90s called Early Voyages that was all about Pike, that, of course, Otoy dipped into when they were doing their unification short film. Of course, no one involved with Strange New Worlds has read that comic series, because if they had, they would have made a better show. So that's how we know they didn't do it. But anyway, it's been fascinating that since 2009, most of Star Trek has been defined by that episode, which is strange to me. But hey, whatever. Because Star Trek since 2009 has only ever referred back to itself. It's stuck in some kind of Ouroboros or some Mobius loop of crazy uncreativity by people that need to look at other Star Trek in order to make new Star Trek, which has really never happened before in Star Trek's history since 2009. But anyway, I don't want to get into that. I got so much ground I want to cover here. I want to begin with a letter to celebrate Star Trek Day, the 59th anniversary of Star Trek. This letter comes to us from Brian Huckabee. Hey, Rob, I'd like to weigh in on Star Trek Strange New Worlds. I'm not a very grandiose letter writer, but I'll try my best to be engaging. First, I'd like to say it was a pleasure talking to you about physical media after Starship Smackdown at this year's San Diego Comic-Con. I'm also a fellow editor, and I enjoyed your comments during episode 1058 about the impact of editing when it comes to storytelling. Raid is rad. Go Rob. Okay, now Star Trek Strange New Worlds, bear with me. When Strange New Worlds first started, I was excited. We finally got to be back on board the Enterprise, always a good thing. The design was appealing on the exterior, although the interior is a bit too flashy looking, and I found this group of actors top-notch. Anson Mount is quite charming as Pike, sort of a hybrid of Shatner and Jeffrey Hunter, and I think Ethan Peck is an outstanding actor to continue the character of Spock, right up there with Zachary Quinto. Personally, I was into the relationship with Nurse Chapel mostly because I enjoyed the chemistry between the two actors, and I was excited at first to see something a little new that we've never seen before. After all, we all know where they end up, so I knew at a certain point they'd have to pivot away from it, right? And if I'm being honest, by the end of Season 1, I was actually a fan, accepting that this is a different reality because too many things started to counter what we know as canon from TOS, like the Spock-Chapel relationship. I guess I had this feeling because I was so put off by the constant tears and drama flooding the frames of Star Trek Discovery. Everyone was so emotional on that ship that I was stunned it was a military vessel. Strange New Worlds was bringing back the fun that can be found in Star Trek. The original series blended serious and silly very nicely, which was definitely missing from Discovery. Now flash forward to Season 2. A few more liberties are taken that I never thought I'd see on Star Trek. The musical episode. I have two opinions on that. Does a show like that fit into Star Trek as easily as it did in Buffy and Xena? Not really. Did I enjoy it anyway? I actually did, just because I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I laughed and was surprised by some of the singing voices the actors had. It's funny to watch Klingons sing like a boy band, sure. And if I recall correctly, I don't think you're a fan of Lower Decks. What I can say about that is, the one Star Trek show that I finally clicked with my daughter was the one Star Trek show the whole family constantly watched. It's an entertaining show that played nicely in the Star Trek universe, with hilarious references. So I especially enjoyed seeing the show's characters, Boimler and Mariner, crossing over into the real world to interact with our crew. It felt like this series' version of Trouble with Tribbles. I was all in, and honestly, Jack Quaid and Tawny Newsome owned that episode. It felt like the other actors were just trying to keep up. But despite all those ludicrous plots, we get this series version of the Gorn. Oh, the Gorn. What is happening here? I don't even know where to begin. Season 3, to quote the great Sam Beckett from Quantum Leap. Oh boy. Every episode I'd seen so far just pissed me off. Trelane and Q, really? That just thoroughly disappointed me. I guess I just so wanted Strange New Worlds to be great after my disappointment with Discovery that I accepted so much of their silliness and canon crapping. Alas, Season 3 has done its job of letting me down. They just keep rehashing old stories, poorly, and visiting very few Strange New Worlds. Where are they? Where are these great stories? Even Spock and Chapel's story is completely dried up. It's such a sappy soap opera now. The bridge crew is so lackluster, and I just watched a brief promo for Season 4 that has Pike as a Muppet. This season and stunts like that are pushing the show very down for me, and as someone who liked Seasons 1 and 2 to a certain extent, I'm losing that desire to revisit them now. Like you, I keep pushing forward, and I'll keep watching them, hoping that one episode where I can finally say, well, now that was Star Trek. Live long and prosper. Brian Huckabee. On YouTube, you can find him at Huck's Pop Culture Cafe, or on Instagram, hucks.pop.culture.cafe. Brian Huckabee. Well, Brian, thanks for writing in. You and I obviously park our shuttlecraft in the same shuttle bay. Now, I'm not going to rehash what I think of Star Trek Strange New Worlds, other than to say I don't understand it. I don't understand it because our world today is full of potential science fiction stories that can be developed within a Star Trek framework. I don't understand why Star Trek Strange New Worlds would at all go back and reference previous Star Trek episodes. characters. I don't understand that at all. I don't understand why half the crew of the Enterprise that we're following is from the original series. I don't understand why Captain Kirk is on this show. I don't understand why Captain Pike half the time has other people, subordinates of his, tell him what to do, or why he's consulting with them. I really don't. I think that a great TV show has its own identity. Star Trek Strange New Worlds could not exist without the original series, and that in itself is a problem. And I don't presume to understand why, other than the fact that the writers really, I guess they have nothing to say about the world around us, which is so interesting because that's what Star Trek always has done best until this show. But anyway, I wanted to jump in and read a few articles. But before I do, I just want to point out a few things happened today on Star Trek Day. They dropped the 9-episode Khan audio drama, which is based on Nicholas Meyer's Nicholas Meyer wrote a 3-night event series, 3 scripts, to do a Khan miniseries to show what happened to Khan after he was marooned on Ceti Alpha 5 and before what happened in Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. Now, this has been material that Star Trek novelists have come after and looked at and examined, like Greg Cox. The Star Trek comics published by IDW did a series called To Serve in Hell. That was all about Khan. So this is well-trodden ground. I don't think Nicholas Meyer had read any of those things, but his scripts I thought were quite interesting. David Mack, my favorite Star Trek novelist of the modern era, and Kirsten Beyer, who's also worked on the show, worked on modern Star Trek. She and David Mack teamed up and wrote a new version of those Nicholas Meyer scripts, adding in brand new characters, adding Captain Sulu, and turning it into a much bigger, sprawling story that has framing devices that don't just deal with Khan. The first episode is available right now. They also announced Star Trek Scouts, a Nickelodeon show basically made for preschoolers that is Star Trek themed. Star Trek Scouts. Hell, when I was a scout, I was a Star Trek scout, but I was like, Cub Scouts and Webelos and went into Boy Scouts, but I didn't stay in Boy Scouts very long. I didn't have enough time. But yet now we're getting a preschool Star Trek, which in my mind is the perfect metaphor for its 59th birthday, that the next new Star Trek TV show we're getting, even before Starfleet Academy, is Star Trek Scouts on Nickelodeon for preschoolers. There you go. But I wanted to start. I have a lot of articles to read that I found that I want to take you on a journey through these articles. And they do a pretty good job of addressing some of my concerns about Star Trek, but also about storytelling in general. And the first article that I found, for those of you keeping score, is on something called Trantor Publishing. Trantor being, obviously, a reference to the Foundation. And if you've been watching it, it's quite good. I finally got to see, with my friend Alvaro and Bill Hunt, the final episode of the 3rd season. What a barn burner that episode and that season is. And, to watch Foundation, to watch its progression and how it's just gotten better and better, and especially season 3, you wonder, why is it that we can get shows like Black Mirror? We can get shows like, I would say, the USS Callister, the second episode of Black Mirror that dealt with a Star Trek parody, was way better than anything we got from Strange New Worlds, and that wasn't even a Star Trek show. But anyway, let's delve into this article that Isaac Young wrote on February 17th of this year. And it starts out, Part 7, What Makes Sci-Fi Great? Obviously, here's a picture of the 2nd season TOS opener, Amok Time, where we finally return to Vulcan for the first time and see some very interesting things. And if you've never seen Amok Time, delve into it, because it's a fantastic episode of Star Trek. Part 7, What Makes Sci-Fi Great? Individual science fiction stories may seem trivial as ever to the blinder critics and philosophers of today, but the core of science fiction, its essence, has become crucial to our salvation if we are to be saved at all, says Isaac Asimov. I don't think Homo sapiens possess any divine right to the top rung. If something is better than we are, then let it take the top rung. As a matter of fact, my feeling is that we are doing such a miserable job in preserving the Earth and its life forms that I can't help but feel the sooner we're replaced, the better for all other forms of life. There's an interesting notion for a Star Trek episode. We're on the cusp of we have generative AI, we're general intelligence, and then super intelligence. Artificial AGI and then ASI. It's coming. There's a conceit among many famous science fiction authors. In fact, it's so endemic I would go so far as to say that this is one of the core struggles of sci-fi in general. You'll scarcely find a popular sci-fi story without this unresolved tension because most of the landmark authors never resolved it in themselves. At one moment, they can rise to the most profound and salvific imagery, and in the next, descend into absolute, mind-shuddering banality. I wouldn't even go so far as to call it nihilism, because nihilism still hints at a romantic struggle against an indifferent universe, at least before it got subsumed by Neil deGrasse Tyson wannabes. Sci-fi can, and often, is both stirring to the soul and utterly mundane, both an inspiring call to action and a slothful shrug at inevitability. So often it's both beautiful and horrendously depressing. And what is so perplexing about this genre is how both these aspects sit practically side by side in so many of the lauded stories we hold up as the great works of art. We've all read or watched that one story that took a sudden, unpleasant detour. The ones coming to my mind right now are Larry Niven's diatribe about population control in Ringworld, Isaac Asimov's extensive subplot about three-way alien intercourse and the gods themselves, and even from an author I otherwise like, Edgar Rice Burroughs, he had some choice words about the dangers of religion in The Gods of Mars. I've spoken about this contradiction before in an earlier essay, but I believe there's a misunderstanding about what sci-fi actually is that is partly to blame for this contradiction. If you were to ask any of the popular names what the purpose or nature of sci-fi is, they would give you a few of these answers. Science fiction is the most important literature in the history of our world, because it's the history of ideas, the history of our civilization birthing itself. Science fiction is central to everything we've ever done, and people who make fun of science fiction writers don't know what they're talking about. That comes to us from Ray Bradbury. One of the biggest roles of science fiction is to prepare people to accept the future without pain and to encourage a flexibility of mind. Politicians should read science fiction, not westerns and detective stories. 2/3 of 2001 is realistic, hardware and technology, to establish background for the metaphysical, philosophical, and religious meanings later. That comes to us from Arthur C. Clarke. Science fiction isn't just thinking about the world out there, it's also thinking about how that world might be. A particularly important exercise for those who are oppressed, because if they're going to change the world we live in, they and all of us have to be able to think about a world that works differently. That was said by Samuel R. Delany. Science fiction is held in low regard as a branch of literature, and perhaps it deserves this critical contempt. But if we view it as a kind of sociology of the future, rather than as literature, science fiction has the immense value as a mind-stretching force for the creation of the habit of anticipation. Our children should be studying Arthur C. Clarke, William Tenn, Robert Heinlein, Ray Bradbury, and Robert Sheckley, not because these writers can tell them about rocket ships and time machines, but more important, because they can lead young minds through an imaginative exploration of the jungle of political, social, psychological, and ethical issues that will confront these children as adults. That was said by futurist Alvin Toffler. Science fiction is not prescriptive, it is descriptive, said Ursula K. Le Guin. If you skipped all these quotes, I don't blame you. Here's the short version. The overwhelming consensus is that sci-fi, insofar as it is striving to be high art, is a sociological genre meant to explore technological and philosophical concepts. It's about predicting and exploring problems of the future in an entertainment medium and about tackling serious issues that might come up in the near present or a future of humanity. Here's the thing. I disagree entirely. Generally speaking, I don't think the vast majority of science fiction has anything particularly unique to say on the future. And from a philosophical, technological standpoint, even the most prophetic of the classic works of sci-fi literature could be better described as fever dreams rather than serious dissertations on our sci-fi future. Just look at most of the great classics and you'll quickly see how hilariously this illusion falls apart. Remember all those far-flung sci-fi stories that were set in the distant future of the 2000s and 2010s? We were supposed to be colonizing the solar system decades ago. If they can't get the basic timelines right, why should anything else be taken seriously? It turned out to be a farce to think we would have a world of Blade Runner by 2019. So why isn't the whole thing a farce? Why do we so easily believe in such a world so long as it's another few decades away? Why do people take seriously the possibility of androids when we couldn't even get flying cars to work? And since we're on this sci-fi's descriptive tangent, of all the classic sci-fi works, how many had mass immigration, global fertility collapse, and racial and religious tensions as the prevailing crises in the West's imminent future? How many stories presented the utter collapse of rationalism and atheism? Star Trek didn't see that one coming, that's for sure. Most stories of the far future thought some form of rationalism was going to be the default. But the way things are looking, it's not going to last another 100 years, let alone the next 1,000. Dune may have called it, but Dune also stands alone. How many talked about the discrediting of every mainstream scientific and political organization? How many about the horrors of social media, the dating crisis, the impoverishment of American and European peoples? And how many of these authors talked about these things accurately? It's one thing to predict robots will replace human labor. Yeah, everyone can see automation looming on the horizon, but how many of those stories were focused on robots replacing factory workers and manual laborers? Something that it's still in its earliest infancy. How many of them talked about the issues we actually face in 2025 with brain-dead chatbots and AI image slop? I'm not worried about Skynet nuking the Earth. I'm worried about whether my surgeon used ChatGPT to cheat on his exams. And let's go a little further. How many science fiction stories were talking about the dangers of bionic racism? Offhand, I know multiple franchises that all focused on this singular issue. And how many didn't say one word on grooming gangs, subway shootings, and certain FBI demographic statistics? All right, so we've narrowed it down to the cyberpunk and post-apocalyptic authors who are providing the real social commentary. But less of the cyber and more of the punk. We aren't living in the Netrunner future so much as Children of Men, except a lot more politically incorrect than Children of Men, if I recall correctly. So the real books of sociological value were less Neuromancer and more 1984, Brave New World, and Abolition of Man. If we're going by the standard sci-fi authors set for themselves, most are utterly BTFO'd on arrival. Forget Hyperion. It's books like The Camp of Saints that provided any real insight into the future, something I suspect most of the authors I quoted would be very uncomfortable about. How many of them were forewarning stuck culture, the reestablishment of racial castes, and the incompetency crisis? We had thousands of stories about pandemic and overreach of the pharmaceutical industry, but how many of those narratives foresaw the TikTok dance videos and George Floyd riots? Even the most dystopian and totalitarian visions of the future rarely took into account the effeminacy, the banality, the day-to-day. What does this say about the vast majority of sci-fi stories? What does that say about the genre as a sociological tool? Far from being a guiding star for humanity, only a fraction of it ever had anything really relevant to say about our current technological and sociological predicaments. At best, they were like a half-envisioned anxiety filtered through a mirror darkly. The prescient sci-fi story was always a diamond in the rough. The one that provides a roadmap for the next 10 years is non-existent, let alone the vast timescales that are so part and parcel of the genre. And if we're really still bent on sci-fi as a sociological tool, I would also like to question our map makers. Look into the lives of many sci-fi authors and the ideologies they promoted. You'll quickly find the genre is populated by the very types of people who sent the West careening off a spiritual and self-existential cliff. If sci-fi could not and did not prevent 2020, the very dystopia everyone was screeching about, then of what use is science fiction? This purported tool of averting the worst of scenarios failed catastrophically, and the only reason we have any hope is because a bullet missed by 3 inches on the very man most of these authors would have denounced. The point is, science fiction stories are not about mass propagandizing the public. At least, that's an abuse. They're not about the future. They're not about the application of technologies or examining potential sociological issues. Nothing about science fiction is about trying to chart a course into the unknown. Any look at a sci-fi story from just a few decades ago tells us far more about what it was like back then instead of now. Forget the future. These stories only really tell us what fantasy storytellers thought at the time. And that's just what every science fiction story ever written is. A fantasy. It's magic. It's all magic. And that might be something very easy to spot with something like Star Trek, but it's honestly applied to all of storytelling. It's all a glamour. Even with something more contemporary like True Detective or Breaking Bad, where the rules of the world more or less line up with our own. Because even if those rules appear to be our own, they are fundamentally not. The only rules fiction obey are the writer's rules, and it is only the suspension of disbelief that convinces us otherwise. It's all fantasy. It's all shadows on the wall. And these shadows have so much power that they have intellectual elites talking about the pros and cons of AGI and Mars colonization, regardless of how feasible those things may or may not be. A lot of people treat Martian colonization as a reality to be considered, a discourse to be had, when the jury's still out on basic things about how badly the human body might deteriorate under low gravity. There's a million things that barely touch the mainstream discourse, like Mars high surface radiation, to the catastrophic failures of creating closed ecosystems, to basic things like reproductive health. There's so much that's up in the air, and yet people treat Mars colonization as real. They can flip on a TV series where the peoples of Mars are launching an interplanetary war with Earth, and they'll take it seriously, when in practice, it might be no less ridiculous than Frodo riding up to Mount Doom in a Honda Civic. People would burst out laughing if the BMW scene actually happened in the movies, and yet they'll take seriously things 10 times more preposterous, like faster-than-light travel, aliens blowing up famous monuments, and yes, also the NCC-1701 Enterprise. The Enterprise is practically and functionally indistinguishable from magic. And all of this is to say that sci-fi itself is practically and functionally indistinguishable from fantasy. It does not matter how hard you do your research or how accurate your spaceships are to what we think they might look like. Just by the nature of storytelling itself, it's all magic. The only crucial difference between sci-fi and fantasy is aesthetic, and that's why science fiction is so important. Science fiction is the only fantasy genre people still believe in. When you turn on a movie and watch Lord of the Rings, you get transported to another world. But it's not your world. True to Tolkien's escapism, you're only visiting, breaking out of the prison for a little while. But besides the Shire, it's not an active dream for people to work for. We can't bring Lord of the Rings into visceral reality, and no one comes away thinking elves or dwarves will be having an impact on their life. Star Trek is magic, but it's a magic people believe in. Space exploration, and especially faster than light, is no different than discussing elves or dwarves in 90% of lay discourse. Practically no one talks about mechanics. No one outside the nerds is getting down to the nitty-gritty. But these concepts float around anyway. They captivate the imagination. They're the modern folklore. Sci-fi is the magic that could be real. Stories didn't change with modernity, only the tropes and forms. What so many sci-fi authors fail to see is that the beating heart of science fiction is not the ideology or the sociology or even the particular ideas. It's not about the political lens or outlining your 500-page manifesto. Sci-fi is no different than any other fiction genre. It's about trying to reach at the real, the numinous. What made Star Trek great was not the rationalism or the ideas of the far future. What made it great were the same things as any other well-told story. It's about life. It's about those things which we experience every single day in our lives, but presented in a way that reminds us that the world is mysterious and dangerous and hopeful and tragic. It's stepping out of the mundanity of our lives and reminding us that existence itself is a miracle. What made Star Trek great were all those times it stepped down from the soapbox and simply became heartfelt. It's about the frontier of the unknown, a world where there are adventures still to be had, foreign lands and peoples where every corner is new. It's about traveling and exploring and sometimes conquering. It's about setting off on a tiny ship toward the horizon, where there be monsters and demons and muttering cannibals, ancient temples to chittering computers and hidden technology. It's about mad androids and strange crystalline entities. It's about stepping on a world where everything is upside down and the people are all clones. It's about comrades in arms. It's about a crew, sometimes a family. It's about love and rage and death, the burden of command, authority, impulsivity, the desire to go out and climb the tallest mountain because it's there. It's about the good times and the bad. It's about the reckless, the braggadocious, the daring. It's about staring into the face of death and having the Reaper blink first. It's about outwitting, outracing, outfighting everyone who thought you would fail. Flying higher and further than anyone has gone before. It's about plunging into the depths of hell and walking out on the other side. It's about war and peace, about struggle with your brother to the death, about good and evil men. It's about the man who rises to the hour and the villain who brings fire upon a whole world. Those who persevere and the cowards. It's about finding God. It's about the prophets and the thieves and the men who cannot tell a lie and the man who can't stop lying. It's about the sweet taste of an impossible victory and the despair of a crushing defeat. It's about courage, honor, and strength. It's about friendship, brotherhood, tragedy. Look to the moments that stir the soul. It's never the dry philosophizing. It's the men. In the first installment of this essay, I discussed the 6 captains and the spiritual mode of each Star Trek series. But now I'd like to take a closer look at some of the characters and subplots. I'm going to stop there because I didn't want to go that far. But I thought that was a pretty good start to what Star Trek is. And I would say that the great failing of Star Trek, especially Strange New Worlds, is it's not about any of those things. Sometimes it thinks it is. But Star Trek, like so many of our franchise IPs, has just become about itself. The writers seem more concerned with the mechanics of a relationship between Spock and his many now different girlfriends. T'Pring, Chapel, Lon. Who cares? What difference does it make? Sometimes the original series touched on Spock's relationships, but it wasn't about the relationship. It wasn't about the soap opera nature of are they going to hook up or aren't they? It was about things that were bigger. Star Trek used to be about those bigger concepts. Now it's barely about anything other than itself. Star Trek Strange New Worlds, if it has anything to say at all, it's because the writers stole something from the original series, as we've seen week after week after week this season. It's because the writers have nothing to say. They have nothing to aspire to. They can't even write an original story. All they can do is not even look at all of the entirety of Star Trek. I mean, hell, there's only one episode of the original series that had the Gorn in it. There was an animated episode, and there was a two-parter back on Enterprise in the 4th season where you got to see a Gorn again. And they were so bereft of any kind of original ideas, they decided to make the Gorn the big bad of Strange New Worlds. Because they couldn't come up with something on their own. They couldn't come up with something new. Because they don't have any good ideas. As a matter of fact, I would dare say the writing staff of Star Trek Strange New Worlds has displayed that they really have no original ideas. They're either stealing from Ursula K. Le Guin's book, Those Who Walk Away from Umlaus, or short story, pardon me, or just various episodes of Star Trek, and they don't credit the original writers. It's really perplexing to watch. And the only thing that they seem to be interested in is the interpersonal relationships of the characters because they want to turn into everything into a Joss Whedon show. Star Trek as Firefly, Star Trek as Buffy, Star Trek as Buffy, Firefly, and Angel all rolled into one. Which is really too bad. But that's where the Star Trek franchise has been since 2009. There hasn't been any original ideas at all. And if they are original ideas, it became about politics and identity politics at that. I just want to give a shout out to the person who wrote that article. That was Isaac Young, and that was from Trantor Publishing. And the article is called Star Trek, What It Means to Tell a Good Sci-Fi Story. As always, you can find the articles I read linked in the description down below. This next piece might be a first. I've never found an article or a piece on LinkedIn before. But this I found on LinkedIn, and I thought it was worth sharing. So here it is. And this article... wait a minute, is not the right article. This is not the right article. This is the right article. This was written by John Ryan. He's a senior writer and narrative design consultant with Horizon Forbidden West, Iron Man VR, Destiny 1/2, Guild Wars 2, Fable 2, Forza 7, Lily's Garden. And he wrote this on March 2nd, 2025. Now, of course, these are video games. But as you can see, what he's writing about is... well, you'll see. 3 things I've learned writing in an established IP. If you are working at a studio, you'll likely be writing for someone else's IP. Either it's a new title, thought up by the studio, Horizon Zero Dawn, it's a sequel spin-off to a hit game, Guild Wars 2, World of Warcraft, or it's an adaptation of an existing IP outside of games, James Bond, Spider-Man, Star Wars. The fact is, you'll be asked to plug your brain in and write inside an established set of rules. Is it hard? Yes. Can it be done? You bet. Here's the 3 things I've learned writing in an established IP. 1. The story Bible is the center of everything. You might be the biggest fan of a franchise. Let's call it Bumble Star Kangaroo. You've played the games, watched the Netflix spin-off. You own all the transmedia, even the rare Alan Moore comic from the BSK2 Ultra Limited Edition. Bumble Star Kangaroo Ultra Limited Edition. You were hired in part because you nailed the game's tone on the writing test. In short, you are the right roo for the job. But that doesn't mean you're an authority on the franchise. No, instead, you've been trusted to work inside of it. Even if you think you know everything about the franchise, you don't. No one does. New stuff gets added all the time, likely before you were hired. Even the people who created the IP use its story Bible to check themselves for timelines, proper nouns, characters, and key plot points. When you start working on a game, have the story Bible open in read-only mode in another tab so you can make sure you aren't misremembering something. And please, 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 do not start adding things to the story Bible without confirming new entries with your lead first, because 2, it's not yours. You didn't invent Bumblestar Kangaroo. You don't own the IP. You are part caretaker and part subject matter expert in training. You are under the direction of your lead, who should guide you in fine-tuning voice and style from the start. The lead, unless overruled by someone higher up, please God, somebody stop. Somebody make Akiva Goldsman stop. Is the final voice for all matters narrative. You are not. This means your headcanon stays in your head. That means you don't take it upon yourself to start adding facts to the story Bible. Any story Bible alteration needs to be vetted through your lead unless otherwise authorized. Sometimes it helps to create a separate document spelling out what you want to add to the story Bible based on a meeting, a mission you worked on, a brainwave you might have had. Hey, I think I have a solution to explain Bumble's disappearance from the potato minefield. How about? The point is, get the sign-off first, preferably in an email for your personal records. This might sound like you're handcuffed into a role where you can't think or create, and this is far from the truth because you can still bring your voice. Writing for an IP is like cooking or playing an instrument. You need to master the basics before you can put your spin on things. When you start working on an IP, you need to make sure you're hitting the tone and how the studio tackles narrative pacing. Once you get the ground beneath your feet, once you can show you work well within the team and with the iteration process, your maturity and skill will be rewarded with you being allowed more leeway to use more of your palette, to take more risks. Your storytelling chops will always be needed. You'll always use your tools to get at the heart of a character, to examine how this quest can reveal more about the world and the people in it, how to set up and pay off an emotional moment. Once you understand the space you're operating in this case the final frontier, you'll know when to push and when to pull back. As time goes on, you will pitch new quests and characters. You will add your contributions to the IP and respectfully build on what's been made before. Done well, you will knit your stuff smoothly into the game's tapestry. Bonus. From personal experience, if you get proficient enough with the IP, you might be asked to create and oversee transmedia created by others. This includes short stories, comic books, audio dramas, and even novels based on the franchise. Writing these will require a lot of other sign-offs from partners or marketers with you as the IP champion at the table. You will need to be sure external partners don't veer too far from the IP's narrative vision and rules. Here you'll be representing the story in the studio at the same time. You'll have a lot of other skills you need to level up to pull this off, from diplomacy to project management. Billion-dollar franchises are serious business, even if they are star kangaroos. I thought this article very worthwhile to share, but I'd like to point out that the leads that are controlling Star Trek don't know anything about the IP at all. They've clearly evidenced that, and the studio, there is no studio. There's nobody, there's no executive team. You have one guy, you have John Van Sitters, who came out of consumer products, and he's the brand manager. But John Van Sitters is also somebody that's not going to tell creatives what they should and shouldn't do. What they need is somebody, a story group, somebody at the top who protects Star Trek canon. Because look, how many other, I mean, if you go to, as everyone knows, Star Trek has Memory Alpha, and Memory Alpha was a place where they kept track of Star Trek lore. Since Star Trek 2009 and onward, Memory Alpha is a mess. They've had to figure out ways to shoehorn in all the fucking bullshit that's been written since 2009 that goes against canon. And why does that matter? Well, it matters because none of it's any good. If modern Star Trek was really good, and it's not, and they've gone out of their way, or actually they haven't gone out of their way, they've barreled straight into it, And they've just changed existing canon because they don't need to use it. Or they don't feel the need. They don't want to be constrained by it. So they've just willy-nilly changed everything. Which is also, I think, a huge misunderstanding of the Star Trek franchise, because people who like Star Trek were very much into that fictional universe. That's why there was encyclopedias. That's why there were concordanates. That's why there were star chart maps that you could look at. All of that stuff has been rendered moot. And you could say, well, Rob, ever since the advent of Next Generation, things were changing. Yes, but you had people that were working on the show that were able to exert some amount of influence. Not a lot, but enough where, because, people weren't, the art department, the Star Trek art department was kind of given a little bit more leeway to put things in. Add things in where they could caress a bump in canon, maybe smooth things over them as much as they could, at least. But not anymore. They're not interested. And they've ruined a franchise, I think. Because why bother? Why delve into the history of Star Trek when there is no history? Middle Earth is immutable until some assholes come along and make the Rings of Power and try and change a bunch of shit around. Same problem there. Because why? Because the Rings of Power was made for one reason: to capitalize on the success of Lord of the Rings. They don't even have the rights to do something right so they could delve into the Silmarillion. They shouldn't have done it. Because all they end up doing is the very thing that made Lord of the Rings appealing was Professor Tolkien's richly drawn world. And all of his great stories, not just things like Lord of the Rings, but, the tale of Beren and Luthien. There was all kinds of stuff that Professor Tolkien had thought about. Well, when you make Rings of Power and you can't use any of it because you don't have the rights to use the Silmarillion, so you got a bunch of writers that are left adrift and they're like, fuck it, we're going to just make up our own shit. As if you could possibly do the work that Professor Tolkien did. So you might get something out of it. You might, and you can say that Season 2 is better than Season 1, but it's still fraudulent created garbage. Because it isn't really Lord of the Rings. And I would say all the way up through Star Trek Enterprise, you still had the DNA of Gene Roddenberry. All the way back to Rick Berman running Star Trek from 87 to 2005. Hey, you might not have agreed with everything he did, but he was trying. He was working with Gene Roddenberry, but he was trying to preserve that goal. It wasn't until Enterprise that he had to deal with the network that was telling him, hey, why don't you put a band on the don't you have a mess hall? Just have a new band every week. That's a true story, by the way. The network wanted them to have a new modern band on every episode of Enterprise. Hogwash, my friends. But anyway, now there is another. There's my LinkedIn story. But here's another one that I found. Now, this one comes from 5 years ago. And I thought it was probably the one that will seem most, pertinent to today. And this was, I don't even know where the daily launch is, but this was, oops, I didn't mean to do that. I just blew it up. So, start date, this was October 22nd, 2020. And I've got to figure out who wrote it. I'll figure that out at the end. Does Star Trek matter anymore? The short answer is no. If you want to know more, then read on. I can remember as a very, very, very little boy being plunked down on the floor in front of the television set at a family friend's house. If I recall correctly, my parents were there to play cards with another couple. My slightly older sister had some dolls and whatnot, as she had reached the age where she could speak and grasp conversation. She was elsewhere in the room, occupied by her own interests. I was of that age wherein TV held more fascination, and while I can't remember what episode it was that played on the network, I do distinctly remember being fascinated by a certain Vulcan's ears. His name was Spock, and my young mind just couldn't figure out those ears. As many of us know, the original Star Trek inspired a generation of television viewers in more ways than one to eventually get up off the couch and do great things for their fellow man. In fact, there was a time when many card-carrying scientists proudly confessed that their whole reason for pursuing such a career was because they saw science being suitably explored on the Gene Roddenberry program. Trek fueled the interests of military men and women, of astronauts and even budding storytellers who wanted to capture their own wagon train to the stars if and when given the chance. But the space show's influence didn't stop there. All one needed to do was look around at the various inventions, now a reality that began in one shape or form as little more than a prop or plot device in Star Trek. Today's tablets are clearly derived from those shown on the original Trek and The Next Generation. In case you missed it, Lieutenant Uhura certainly sported the very first Bluetooth earpiece. Automatic doors and giant panel television screens are everywhere, both in the home and beyond. Things like GPS, portable memory drives, and the flip phone began with the inspiration of storytellers, and now you could very well be reading this think piece on a smartphone yourself. It's true that we're still waiting on holodecks and warp drive, but rest assured that the tech is on someone's drawing board as you finish this very sentence. Though I've always argued that Star Trek is one of television's only programs that is truly timeless, and some of that's owed to being set in an era a few hundred centuries, that's what it says, but a few hundred years away, as well as universal, I've never insisted that it would always matter. In fact, I'd strongly suggest that today's Treks, those airing almost exclusively behind CBS's paywall, might be best forgotten when compared with what's come before. And that's not a reflection on quality, because these ventures are arguably well made, well produced, and well acted. Simply put, I find them hollow by comparison to what I grew up with. And that's why when I woke up this morning, I asked myself, does Star Trek matter anymore? I come from a generation of kids that built things. We built forts. If we wanted to play superhero, then we had to cull together our own suits, our own capes, our own weapons. If it were the winter, we'd go out in the snow in our gloves and our boots, and we'd spend the better part of a day building this expansive fort to house our adventures. We didn't care that Mother Nature would have most of it thawed out by tomorrow or the next day, if certainly not by the weekend. To us, a half-melted fort only meant that the alien invasion had arrived sooner than we'd planned, and we'd soldier on. Infamously, we cut our knees, we scraped our elbows. If we weren't careful, then we broke a few bones. We'd get back up, dust ourselves off, and try again. We knocked the wind out of one another. When we rode bikes, we'd build ramps, and we'd soar through the air, even though we knew we were about to suffer the worst pain imaginable when we hit the ground again and our testicles were suitably mashed. Boys, that is. And maybe even the girls amongst us who have imagined themselves as boys, but that's an argument for another day. Our parents might have invented Band-Aids, Mercurochrome, and Bactine, but we were the generation that forced them to put it to good use. They paid for our wounds, sometimes handsomely. Today's children? Well, it would seem that they do the bulk of their living virtually. No, I'm not putting down gamers and or gaming. This is a cultural reflection about why Trek mattered then and how that's evolved. And indeed, carpal tunnel can be a harsh mistress, but that's a far cry from falling face first from your treehouse from 20 feet up. One generally leaves a mark, and the other is treated with an anti-inflammatory drug. While it's true that both require a bit of imagination, a requisite part of any good childhood, there's still something intangible about getting your hands dirty. It just feels good. Because much of the child's experience is transformed from the real world to the virtual one. Dare I suggest that we as a society have lost some of our own ability to dream? Think of it this way. One generation put a man on the moon, while the next one put a robot on Mars. One generation sent a man thousands of miles away from Earth at the risk of life and limb, while the other sat at a receiving console, safely watching a video stream play out. One man planted a flag somewhere that the wind never blows, and another punches buttons, releasing the footage to the world so that everyone gets a participation trophy for this trip to the Red Planet. Both events have significance. Both events require an incredible amount of technical expertise to make them happen. Still, one of them seems fairly hands-off. Storytelling interests people, and good storytelling inspires them. Star Trek's morality tales were clearly grounded in the popular myth-making of television's golden era. Don't get me wrong. I've never believed, unlike others, that Star Trek's ability to spin good yarn had all that much to do with catapulting mankind into some new age of modern thinking and holistic living. At the end of the day, a character whose face was painted half black and half white was just an actor in makeup. A good story that made me think about the wider world outside was honestly a little more than that. A mirror held up for my own reflection. After all, here was a show that purported to whisk us culturally to a time when mankind had apparently done away with all vices, and still each villain of the week required audiences to undergo yet one more rectal exam of said defeated vices. If the future was so perfect, clearly not everyone was getting the memo. Like all good morality tales, Star Trek needed heroes, and the crew performed admirably whenever given the chance. Each of them had a purpose, a function on this ship, and it was their particular skill set that more often than not helped save the day. Be it more fast flying by Sulu at the helm, Dr. McCoy handling a particularly difficult surgery in sickbay, or Scotty squeezing one last bit of power out of the warp core. They proved themselves the best at their respective positions, and rarely were they required to be as exceptional outside of that requisite box. See where I might be going with this? In other words, Uhura was a master at communications. Never did she pull a second shift and say, medical. Her role was on the bridge, supporting command in any related capacities, and in that respect she served wonderfully. When you have a purpose, a driving inspiration, you can be the best. When you're all over the map or taxed with being an expert on everything within your reach, the best is rarely, if ever, achieved. Any professional athlete will tell you that excellence is 90% repetition. An excellent pitcher pitches all the time, every game, every chance he gets. It's that repetition that turns into muscle memory, and when the muscles are trained to do something over and over and over again, they naturally get very adept at performing under all kinds of circumstances and stresses. When you can't win every game based solely on pitching, there's no doubt that the quality pitching will have occurred in every game that's won. The same analogy can be made of every Starship crew member. Even the best navigator known to man will have a tough time surviving when the captain keeps requiring you to steer through hell. Today's Star Trek, from what I've seen, doesn't appear to be crafted as morality plays. Instead, they're gripes about what the scriptwriting staff just plain doesn't like about the world around them. More specifically, they're slightly veiled attacks on political policies they personally abhor. These screenwriters are using these characters, many of them beloved, to deliver not so much a message of unity as they are clarion cries of revolution for things that might not be in the best interests of humanity, but rather for their own personal wish list. Instead of championing ideas that we as a culture have already come together against, these storytellers appear more interested in tearing things apart than putting things right. This, by itself, is not without inspiration. The casual Trek enthusiast need only to peruse the information superhighway for mentions of, we are Starfleet, a phrase downright majestic if it weren't for its own ambiguity. Instead of focusing on the action phrases of seeking out and exploring strange new worlds, much like the children of a certain generation who rode bikes, climbed trees, and broke bones, this next generation has taken to rallying its youth and youth at heart with politically sounding catchphrases that have no doubt been test marketed and focus grouped for maximum malleability. We are Starfleet. What does it mean? Well, it can mean anything you want it to. Perhaps I'm reading more into it than I need, but I'm older than most and tend to do that on every occasion. Perhaps I'm seeing seeds planted in this new cavalry of viewers meant to inspire them to run out, burn down cities, and tear down statues, if for no other reason than to avoid being offended. Perhaps a franchise once meant to unite the species around one central path forward is being used to divide us, to categorize us as for Starfleet or against Starfleet, at a time when unity has been found out of step with the contemporary intelligentsia. Perhaps I find it painful to see one of television's most beloved franchises, something that's brought joy and personal inspiration to countless millions, being refashioned into something meant to be a vehicle of change for only a fateful few. Or perhaps I'm wrong, as usual. I've always said that first and foremost, Star Trek is a business. and throughout much of the late 1990s when Trek's motion picture films went through some curious highs and lows as the next generation separated itself from its parents, labeling it as a commercial property was controversial. I can't tell you the number of times I was berated for doing such a simple thing, something honestly fairly benign given what creates debate online today. I was threatened with being banned from message boards, ask your parents. I was warned I wasn't getting Trek's central message. I was even branded not a true Trekkie by some who claimed to know better. For those who don't know their history, Gene Roddenberry left the original show in its third season, and one of the things he did was expand on the marketing possibilities surrounding his show. Like George Lucas saw with the potential for growing an empire around Star Wars about a decade later, Roddenberry saw it with Trek. He turned his eyes toward capitalist ventures that could possibly grant him the income required to continue seeking out and exploring other possibilities. Go figure that he treated Trek like a business. Granted, he still made the rounds speaking at colleges and universities and conventions. He met with anyone willing to host him for purposes of, once again, keeping alive his vision of mankind's future, that very enterprise itself, and he did so with the hope that Star Trek would live long and, dare I say, prosper. He never wanted it to end, and thankfully he didn't let it, nor did Paramount. They persevered the way good businessmen and women do, and it's still around today. It'll likely grow and change into something else for that next generation, those who were born today while I've been writing this piece and have obviously yet to discover it. While there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, I'm still convinced that what Trek is today bears so little resemblance from where it's come from that it needn't even have the Trek name attached to it. It does solely because it's a good business sense. And there's that whole business thing again. But does it? Does Star Trek matter? Well, the long answer is above, and I gave you my short one at the outset. So you've no one to blame at this point but yourself. I suppose it's safe to suggest that it only matters so much as you want it to matter. Art is, after all, entirely subjective, so it only matters so much as any one of us wants to give it meaning. I think not, that it doesn't matter, but as I've said, I've been wrong before, and so was Kirk. Again, these all articles are sort of meant to be interlinked, and you can take them as you want them. I'm just presenting them so you can make up your own minds. Now, I want to find out the author of this article. It comes from the Daily Launch. Let me go to the About. It doesn't say who it is. Sci-fi-history.net. So I apologize, sir, that I have bogarted your article and read it, but I will try and send people your way. But again, this comes from the Daily Launch, and this was from 10/22/2020. And I keep looking for who wrote this, but there you go. Again, the link is in the description. So before I get to my final and fourth article, let's see if you all have anything to say. I can imagine that you might. So first of all, let's see. Let me get to where I want to be. So B Things said, I'm tired of people telling me to be grateful for the corporate trash just because they slapped Star Trek or Star Wars or Marvel on it. I totally agree with you. And again, I mean, yeah, it's a lucrative job, but they've been running into the ground for quite some time. Let's see where we are. Joe D sends in a tip and says, I simply cannot accept that New Trek is canon. Bad writing aside, I actually find that I can enjoy it a little bit more on its own in my head, if I consider everything is in an alternate universe and not canon. Curious if that works for you at all. Well, I can't do that, mostly because the stories are terrible. I mean, so you finally get Ortegas, I really like her as an actor, a performer. I don't understand why the haircut, but they give Ortegas her own episode. She flies the ship, right? And she takes shuttlecraft, and I understand they have to figure out some way to isolate her and put her in a situation, but she ends up crashing the ship. She ends up not being excellent at her job, which I thought was an interesting choice. Maybe I'm nitpicking here, but I'm like, couldn't you have figured out a different way to put Ortegas into a situation where, she just wasn't skilled enough to stop her shuttlecraft from crashing? So, I mean, maybe that's just me. The Dead Man became a new member of the channel and gifted another membership. So thank you for that, The Dead Man. I hope you're not really dead, and I hope you're bringing a little life to this channel, which I appreciate very much. The Dead Man says, Rob, I was a member for 24 months, but apparently my membership lapsed. I'm sorry. Well, listen, I'm just happy you were here, The Dead Man, and thank you for supporting the channel. The Dead Man says, and Star Trek Scouts? Good Lord, they are desperate. Christ, also, Strange New Worlds has lost me, and I defended that show for a long time. Well, as people pointed out, Star Trek Scouts has nothing to do with, apparently, Alex Kurtzman or Secret Hideout. And look, I get the idea of trying to get kids involved with the Star Trek concept while they're kids. But to me, it just shows how we infantilize our kids. Do you know, when I was 5 years old, do you know what my favorite TV show was? Let's think about it. Let me ask you all, like, knowing me and knowing this channel, let me ask you, what was my favorite TV show when I was 5? That's right, Star Trek, the original series. I didn't need a show that was directed at me as a kid. I understood they made Star Trek the animated series in 73 and 74, and I liked it, but I'm like, and I have to say, for a children's show, it was very, very sophisticated, and I appreciated the fact that you had a lot of the original writing staff, and while it was limited in its budget, there was a lot of really interesting stories in the animated show, as evidenced by what Alan Dean Foster did when he novelized those episodes in his the 10 Star Trek logbooks. So, it's weird to me that they keep trying to make Star Trek for young people. The way you make Star Trek for young people is you tell compelling stories that are somehow, they're allegorical tales, morality plays about things that are going on today that appeal to the world. Look, if you want Star Trek to appeal to young people, you have to make Star Trek episodes that are about the world that they live in. They can recognize things that are going on in the world today. Strange New Worlds has fucking nothing at all. Discovery was all about identity politics, and people can be like, oh, I see myself represented on the screen. Maybe I'll watch this show. But they didn't watch it because of the compelling stories. They watched it because they saw themselves represented on a screen. You know, the interesting thing is there's a lot of people who identified with Spock because they felt alien themselves, and they identified metaphorically or in whatever way with the Spock character. But just affirming people's identities is not great television drama, nor is it a way to keep those people. You still have to tell great stories and insightful stories that somebody can look at and go, this matters. I understand what they're trying to say to me within the context of an action-adventure allegorical science fiction show. That's how you get young people. You tell them stories that are relevant to them, not their identities, because that doesn't last. Identities are malleable. People change. What you have to do is tell them stories that are timeless, not that are riding the wave of, you know, when you start having a person 1,000 years in the future correcting people about their pronouns, you've lost that battle. Your stories suck, and they're not going to appeal to anybody in the long run. They're already horribly dated, and they're taking place 1,000 years from now. Doesn't work. So the Dead Man, you're right, they are desperate. And, I know. People are always trying to say, but Rob, Strange New Worlds is so much fun. Strange New Worlds, to me, bears no resemblance to the original series. At all. It's weird. You're asking me, it's kind of like the Invasion of the Body Snatchers pod people version of Star Trek, except instead of making you kind of monotone, it's gone in the other direction. It's turned into a silly morass of ridiculousness that makes no sense and also has nothing to say. And all they do is go back and retcon original series episodes that were better written and had better messaging and were more interesting than what you're telling me now. I mean, that episode with Ortegas, you rip off Enemy Mine, you rip off Arena, you ruin the Metron, and it's Hell in the Pacific, which they've done on UFO, they've done on every science fiction TV show ever. You know, and you look at that and you're like, There's not one. You're ripping off like 5 things, and there's not one shred of originality in your story. And you did Ortegas dirty because she didn't fly the ship. She crashed. What would have been more interesting is if Ortega's flying is what saved everyone's life. That it would more go Galileo 7, where you're kind of able to, show what being a great pilot could do for you. Terrible. Just terrible. Hemorrhoid Hurts says, Star Trek Discovery and Picard destroyed my 50-year Star Trek love affair. To me, it's dead. It's never coming back. I binned my entire collection, but I like to listen to Rob. I got to tell you, to make myself feel better, and because it doesn't cost very much, I've been going back and, because I lost all these books, I've been looking for the mint condition classic Bantam Star Trek novels, and because they have to be in great, I can't deal with paperbacks that have split, and I sort of rediscovered my love of Star Trek. I mean, I have a lot of my reference books, but I lost all these books, and you can find these in great shape, and they're not expensive. So I'm kind of just going back just because I want my books back again. I want to be reminded of when I was a kid and going to these bookstores, and when I'd come up with a new Star Trek book, it would be so exciting. Things that brought me joy. 1001 Johnny says, friendly reminder, unless you announced on physical media you've already watched these. 1001 Johnny wants me to delve into and watch these Ultraman stories. And whenever I talk about Star Trek, he brings these up. The Mysterious Dinosaur Base, the Pearl Defense Directive, The Return of Ultraman, Episode 20, The Monster is a Giant Shooting Star in Space Ultraman, Omega, and Episode 2, The Alien Scholar and I. So there you go. Look up those episodes. Go watch them. Get back to me. Darren says, I guarantee a Spock and Kirk love story happens. Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. And look, I bought Slash Fiction when I was like 12. I was looking at beautifully rendered drawings of Kirk and Spock having a sweaty male sex with one another, usually, interestingly enough, created by women. So I had a collection of Slash Fiction. I thought it was fascinating. To go into phrase, I didn't really understand like where that came from. I understand that impulse because fans are always going to fan. But yeah, I'm sure somebody will want to do that. A $20 tip from Science and Reason Lover. Thank you very much for that. I appreciate that. Just saying thanks for all you do. I plan to send in some letters on what makes a perfect movie. Ooh, I want to read those. I have a few ideas on what a perfect movie is. Darren sends in a super chat and says, Strange New Worlds steals in every episode and has 0 new ideas. I know. And I find that we live in a world where, follow Peter Gallagher's character, his character in Robert Altman's The Player, when he's talking about finding stories, and he opens a newspaper and he's like, look, inner city teacher makes good. You put Jimmy Smits in it, and you have a sexy stand and deliver. That's what Star Trek should be. You should be reading science journals. You should be reading Wired. You should extrapolate on all these things around us. Instead, it's like, let's bring back Trelane and relate him to Q, and we'll bring back Dr. Corby because canonically Corby and Christine Chapel are gonna get married. Like, fuck off, fuck you. Make your own characters. Come up with new people. Read the Pike comics, early voyages. I mean, they're better. They're better than the swill that you have been serving up. I mean, my God, leave the original series alone. It's too bad. It's already wrecked. I mean, the original, what was the original first season of Star Trek? 29 episodes. By the end of the 3rd season of of Strange New Worlds, we're going to get finally 30 episodes. It took them 3 years to get where Star Trek went in 1. And look at the diversity of storytelling. The original series, did the Gorn better? Did the Romulans better? Did Pike better? Did everybody better? They have not exceeded anything with Strange New Worlds, and everything they rip off is just a reminder that we should go back and watch the original series, which is better. And that's it. That's just, it makes me angry. But thank you, B Things. I already did that one. Doomed, huh? What do you think about them adding CGI to Wizard of Oz? Okay, well, here's the thing. People have asked me this. This is a legit question. So for those of you who don't know, they've made an event at the Sphere in Las Vegas. And they did a cut down. They edited Wizard of Oz, and they turned it into a big kind of interactive, the ultimate D-box theater experience. And for what it is, you know, adding scene extensions and all that and making it this event, you can still get the original Wizard of Oz, and everyone knows that it's something that was created for the Sphere. And I mean, the $250 price tag, I wanted to get tickets. I'm like, I can't afford that. You know, I can go back and get a classic Star Trek novel for less than $10. I don't want to you know, pay $250 to see a truncated version of Lord of the Rings in the Sphere when I've got a Blu-ray of it, you know, or actually I have a 4K of Wizard of Oz. But I would say that it's interesting. As long as the original's available, I don't have a problem with it. It's an interesting thing, and maybe it'll inspire somebody to do something even more interesting, which could be very interesting to see, whatever they're going to do. But yes, I understand, like, you're still working with AI, and are you desecrating the original work? As long as the original work is available, I don't have a problem with it. John Suntress from the Word Balloon podcast says, New Trek tries to fix problems that don't need fixing, like the Metron's Arena Redux. Pointless, derivative, garbage. Well, I couldn't have said it better myself. I couldn't believe that they brought the Metron in. Like, here's my problem. The arena and that reveal of the Metron is so unique to the original series. It was such a great moment from my childhood. You know, I wanted Kirk to kill the Gorn. They just wrecked it. Just like Discovery wrecking the Guardian of Forever. And these assholes think that they've done, we've done something good. No, you haven't. Don't do that. How about not do that? Why not you write an original story? You don't get, or actually they wreck it. They wreck it. They just went and wrecked it. They are destroyers of joy, destroyers of world. It is fraudulent creation. It drives me crazy. And it wasn't as good. You're not even ripping off just Arena. You have to rip off TNG's The Enemy, which is actually Hell in the Pacific or whatever. There's so many different stories you're ripping off. They can't just be content to rip off one. They rip off like 4 different stories in one episode. By the time Discovery Strange New Worlds finishes its run, they'll probably have touched on every single major TOS episode. They talk about, let's do an original TOS series. Why? You'll have nothing left to rip off. You will have got to it already. It's maddening. Maddening. Good to see you though, John. Mr. Erickson? Is it Mr. Erickson? Says, I read an article from Comics Beat today about what they want to see for future Trek. The only thing they desired was representation, not quality. Yawn. How about great storytelling? You know, that's another thing. People aren't really interested in great storytelling. I just want to see myself. It's all main character syndrome. The world has become, you know, it used to be that article talking about what kids were doing. Kids were out into the world. They were boldly going. We as kids boldly went. That's what we did. We went out into the world and saw what was out there. You know, it's like Frances McDormand's character in Almost Famous. You know, go to Europe. Look around. See what you like. You know, I mean, that's one of my favorite movies of all time, by the way. Top five favorite movies of all time. The extended version of Almost Famous. Yeah. Let's see. Representation. Oh, B Thing says, they also diminish Spock's relatability, in my opinion, by making it feel like I'm not allowed to relate to him if I don't share his new Trek diagnoses. Oh, yeah, they've saddled Spock. We have to give him a learning disability so he can be more like me. No. What they've done to Spock is criminal. Total misreading of the character. Let's saddle him. The thing about Spock is he has to be better than both humans and Vulcans. That's his whole thing. And people are like, well, Spock isn't the Spock we get to know and love. Yeah, he is. He grew up with a human mother. You think he doesn't know any? I mean, this is such a dumb assumption on the writers' parts. I don't know what idiots came up with this idea. Probably Akiva Goldsman going, listen, I have the Oscar. You have to listen to me. Spock is not fully formed yet. That's why he smiled in the cage. Give me a fucking break. You need to extrapolate. You know, we can all look at production mistakes because when they made the cage, they hadn't settled on all these things yet. And remember, Spock was just the science officer. He wasn't even the first officer yet. So he smiled with delight. You know what you should do? You should be like, okay, obviously Spock is, but what you should understand is Vulcans have emotions. They just choose to control them. When Spock smiles, it is a little burst of emotion he has in the cage. Now, here's my headcanon. Because he's delighted by finding the plants that are blowing and causing that sound, that Star Trek planetary sound. When he finds that, as a scientist, he allows himself, he doesn't keep his joy in check because it's the discovery that he's made on an alien world. That's why he smiled. When he touches those leaves and then lets them go and hears the sound again, he probably can hear something more than we can, which delights him even more. And for that moment, he lets go. And we've seen it again at the end of Amok Time, when he sees that Kirk is alive. He smiles again. And you can't tell me that, he wasn't the Spock we know and love. No, he was exactly the same fucking guy. But that moment, just like in the cage, he had a moment where, what? He was so delighted by seeing his captain was alive that for that particular moment, his control left him. And do you know why? Because they're not unfeeling. Remember, the Romulans lit off and founded Romulus and their civilization. They were Vulcans, and Vulcans are more passionate than human beings are. And it doesn't mean that for that moment you got to give. That's why Spock's a great character. When he saw his captain not dead, even a Vulcan with that much control of his emotions, that's how delighted he was. And I would say that the discovery in the cage is the same thing. And people are like, why was Spock like this? Blah, blah, blah. No, because you're all fucking dumb. I'm sorry. So let's base a whole character around one little smile. Why don't you extrapolate and come up with an interesting idea like I just did and threw out to you about why that smile happened? Don't base your character on it. Go, he was not fully formed. Dr. Mbenga had to get him a lute so he could learn to play music. Fuck all that. Spock is a lifelong musician. He sight reads. He can sit down at a harpsichord on Flint's planet and play a little. You know, sight read a Brahms that he's never heard before and be like, oh my God, this is from Brahms. He sight reads. He knows how to play music. He didn't learn because he was feeling anxiety because he turned human and Dr. Mbenga said, hey, it's so gross. It's so gross. The writing is so bad. It's so stupid. It's just dumb writing. That's why I hate watching Strange New Worlds. They've got all this great production design, all the great special effects, all the bells and whistles, and the writing is written by fucking infants. Infants. God, it's so bad. I hate it. I hate it. Sandman says, run, runner. Everyone should see Logan's Run. And by the way, I can't say who. It's finally coming out in 4K. Do you know who his seed mother was? There's a line for you from Logan's Run. I was 6 when I watched What Are Little Girls Made Of? Scared the crap out of me, but also hooked me for life. Well, you know what? You're another 6-year-old won't have that same response because he will have already met Roger Corby in an episode of Strange New Worlds. Yay! 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 Which characters from the first season of Star Trek can we revisit? Let's see. We got Trelane. We got the Romulan commander from Balance of Terror. We got the Gorn from Arena. We got the Metron. I mean, why would you want to do that to yourself? I don't know. Yeah. The Dead Man goes on to say, I'm not dead yet. It's the Grateful Dead. I like that. 200 Watt Studio says TOS portrayed alien species with respect and as metaphors for what we should be. We learned from aliens learning and the Federation learning. Everyone got respect. New Trek gives no one respect. I totally agree with that. all it does is diminish its characters. Have you ever, I mean, who would have thought that Anson Mount's Captain Pike would be jobbed in every episode? Unbelievable. Unbelievable. That show exists because, ironically, during Discovery, Anson Mount was the only character that felt like they actually, oh, here's Anson Mount, Captain Pike, walking in from the actual Star Trek universe. And it's ironic that they create Strange New Worlds, really a show that was based around one guy. And to be fair, Ethan Peck is good as Spock, even though he's written terribly. But he certainly tries hard. So, yeah. Yes. John Suntress asks if I'm a fan of Colossus, the Forbin Project, AI dystopia classic. For those of you who don't know, I believe Joseph Sargent directed Colossus, the Forbin Project. Eric Braeden plays Dr. Forbin. So in Colossus, the Forbin Project, which came out in 1970, it is a great science fiction movie you should all seek out. Now, you're going to laugh at it because it's about an AI. It's about this AI Colossus that they turn on. It's going to solve all of the human problems. So Colossus is so big, it's like built into the Grand Canyon. It's this giant AI that is going to control the world. But I don't want to ruin it for you if you've never seen it. It's a really interesting film. Now you have to put aside the fact that you're going to laugh and like we have more computer technology on our desktops than the Forbin Project had in its depiction of Colossus. But it's a really, really interesting film. It's based on a series of 3 novels, by the way. And one of those novels is called Colossus and the Crab. But you need to watch Colossus, the Forbin Project. It's a great slice of 70s science fiction. As a matter of fact, I recently rewatched both Colossus, the Forbin Project, and The Andromeda Strain, directed by Robert Wise, who directed Star Trek the Motion Picture, and of course edited Citizen Kane, directed Curse of the Cat People, directed West Side Story, directed Day the Earth Stood Still, actually co-directed West Side Story. But both Colossus, the Forbin Project, and The Andromeda Strain was Michael Crichton's, it was his first novel, and it was directed by Robert Wise. It's great. Both of those 2 movies, while they might be dated, because they're serious and they take themselves seriously, they're great early 70s science fiction. They're both widescreen epics. And I got to tell you, they're both available. You can get, I don't know if Colossus is in 4K, but it is. I have the Blu-ray. And Colossus, the Forbin Project was released by Universal in a double Laserdisc set, along with another slice of early 70s sci-fi, Douglas Trumbull's Silent Running, which I would recommend to everybody. Actually, as a matter of fact, Colossus, Silent Running, and The Andromeda Strain, while obviously very dated, are all movies that have great conviction, and the filmmakers, when you watch them, you'll really get a lot out of them. They're really great movies to watch. So yeah, Hail, Hail, Fire and Snow, the very worst episode of Star Trek, the original series. Melvin Belli, you got to love the fact that in David Fincher's Zodiac, Brian Cox plays Melvin Belli, and talks about that, being on Star Trek. What was it like to be on Star Trek? In Zodiac. God bless you, David Fincher. Annoying Critic. Actually, Hail, Hail, Fire and Snow says happy birthday, RMB. Thank you for that. I appreciate that. Annoying Critic says, in Star Trek Discovery, it is revealed that Spock suffered from a learning disability similar to dyslexia. Rant on. Yeah, I know. I mean, see, to me, that is the height of hubris. That, we can't relate to a character like Spock, so what do we have to do? We have to give him a trait that we relate to. So it's not enough that Spock is a man of 2 worlds. It's not enough that he has a human mother and a Vulcan father. It's not enough that he chose to leave his Vulcan heritage behind against the will of his father, who wanted him to go to the Vulcan Science Academy, but instead he joined Starfleet, a Vulcan with wanderlust that wanted to get away from his father. There's not enough there to deal with, and plus you have you have even Spock, Leonard Nimoy's Spock did appear in Star Trek 09 and Into Darkness and all that, and you feel the need to saddle him with a learning disability. That to me is the height of terrible writing. Terrible. Discovery was terrible.
Well, we have to make him relatable because we can't just be an alien. If he has the Vulcan equivalent of oh yeah, let's make him dyslexic.
It's the dumbest shit in the world. Now you might say to me, Rob, why then, if you look at the third season Next Generation episode Sarek, they saddled Sarek with a malady. He has Alzheimer's. The difference there is that Sarek was already a tremendous character, and by saddling him with an aging disease, because we all age, Bendy syndrome, and the idea that Sarek was literally losing control of his faculties, his mental faculties, this is a terrible thing for a Vulcan. So in that instance, the story becomes relatable to all of us, and the story hinged on that. With Spock's dyslexia, they just needed another crutch so they could write about it. They gave him a crutch after 50 years of the character existing, so the writers could, fall back on something because they couldn't write the story of a man of two worlds.
And the idea Spock is the man he's going to become in the original series. Really?
Were you that different from the time you were like 25 to 30? You don't think a lot of your and by the way, Spock is this idea that Spock is exactly the same age as Kirk has always bugged the fuck out of me. But anyway, just because Nimoy and Shatner were 4 days apart, but hey, whatever. Tom Jr. Jackson he's been a member of this channel for 58 months. That's amazing. Tom Jr. Jackson celebrates 58 month of membership and says, "Big Bobby B, I got the new Dan Brown book coming tomorrow and Jurassic Rebirth, keeping physical media alive. I saw North by Northwest at the movies today." Wow, it's great seeing classic films. Seeing Jaws in the theater was so much fun. I love having these opportunities to see these great movies. Tom, you're a prince among lesser men. Secular Monk says, "I caught your defense of physical media on Campia. Thanks for defending our honor." Well, if you look at my Instagram, I was re-alphabetizing my 4K collection. I put a picture up. 1001 Johnny says, "Ho ho, you'll never be able to pass off watching Ultraman by having others watch it for you, Rob. I also still have to come up with more recommendations since Star Trek rants shall never end. Maybe I should start a backlist." Maybe you should. I leave that up to you. Captain J.T. Kirk says, "To me, all of modern Trek does not exist. It's all a bad holo novel created by Voyager's Doctor." Yeah, but unfortunately, if you go to Memory Alpha, they have to incorporate all this bullshit into it, which is ridiculous. But I agree. It doesn't seem like it's canonical to me. 200 Watt Studio says, "Colossus, The Forbidden Project, and Demon Seed are a great double bill." Demon Seed came a little bit later. I really do like Demon Seed. Demon Seed. Now, I've never understood, I'm not sure on this, because Dean Koontz wrote either the original book Demon Seed was based on, or he wrote that as a novelization. I'm not sure. I don't know. But Demon Seed came out in 76? 77. Demon Seed is about a great AI voiced by Robert Vaughn. It's amazing. Who wants to procreate and locks poor Julie Christie in a smart house and ends up having the computer has its way with her and impregnates her with his seed. And if you haven't seen Demon Seed, another great slice of 70s science fiction. I guess I should give people a trigger warning since it does have a computer having its way with Julie Christie in a way that's not necessarily something everybody wants to see, but the movie's definitely worthy. So 200 Watt Studio is onto something there. 200 Watt Studio, the only thing that is better maybe than Demon Seed is To Live and Die in L.A. Royston S. Bailey says, "All the melodrama in Strange New Worlds will never equal that single tear in Sarek." Oh, 100%. 100%. Royston is absolutely right. Like, you watch Sarek, one of the things about Sarek, the third season TNG episode, is when he's listening to this classical performance. And you know that he's starting to lose control of his emotions because he allows a tear to fall down his cheek. And that was so earned. That was the writer's totally understanding. And by the way, the great fantasist Peter S. Beagle, who wrote The Last Unicorn. And if you guys want to read, my old girlfriend Mary Forrest turned me on to a Peter S. Beagle story that, by the way, should be turned into a movie. I looked into this rights, and it was I was going down the road to get the rights to this story. It's a story called A Fine and Private Place. It is a wonderful, wonderful story that I desperately wanted to turn into a film, but Peter S. Beagle's, I don't know if it was his manager, his lawyer, was very adamant about not letting that story go. But anyone out there, I mean, look, all my other great ideas and things I want to turn into movies get taken. Waystation, come on, guys. You're going to make Waystation into a big sci-fi epic? No. It should be a $10 million A24 movie. That's what it should be. But Matt Reeves and company, I was trying to get the rights to that, and then it just shows up one day. Because, got re-released, 1963 Hugo Award-winning novel. I understand. But I'll throw it out there. I've got a hardcover of the Fantasy Worlds of Peter S. Beagle. He came up with a story for Sarek. Read his story, A Fine and Private Place. First of all, what a great title. And you could find a great actor to play that. The actual graveyard that a lot of it's set in is a real place. You go shoot there. That's what I want to do. I want to make a fine and private place. B Thing says, I don't think you've ever read a letter I sent a few weeks ago about Star Trek, but I think it was maybe a bit of a pompous twat at points in it. Sorry. No one's a pompous twat in the letters they write to me. I'll go find it. I just haven't got, I've got a backlog of letters because I haven't. So don't worry, I will get to it. I will get to your letter, B Things. Don't think I won't, because I will. It's just a question of where I'm at. Now I have another letter or another article to read. Now this article is written by my very first. This is going to seem funny, but I'll tell this story because I haven't told it in a while. I just told this to Alvaro, my friend Alvaro. So I love Star Trek novels. And what happened was so there are really two eras in Star Trek novels. Like these novels were from the Bantam era, like the Starless World, the Trek to Mad World, Planet of Judgment, and Devil World. Now they were in varying degrees of quality, but the people that wrote these books, and they were few and far between. Like there was maybe one a year, and when I would find them, I was like, oh my God. As far as tie-in fiction went, when I first found, and this is important, so one of the things I didn't show was, so James Blish was a science fiction novelist, Cities in Flight and all that. He started novelizing Star Trek episodes, and and this came out when Star Trek first went on the air. So he was, and there's like, what is there, like 5 episodes in here? Something like that. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 Star Trek episodes he turned into novelized form. So, and my father would read these to me when I was a kid. He would read these to me when I was going to bed. And so the first Star Trek novel I found was in elementary school. And I found it in my elementary school library, and it was written by James Blish, and it was called Spock Must Die. And I couldn't believe it. And to me, that, because James Blish had been novelizing the Star Trek episodes, that he wrote an original Star Trek novel, meant in my mind as a child that this was legitimate Star Trek. No one could tell me that it wasn't canonical. Nobody could say that these are legends, because James Blish was obviously connected to real Star Trek, because he was novelizing the Star Trek episode. So I bought that. I went out and bought, and that was like 95 cents. And I read Spock Must Die. It was, it was great when you were a kid, because obviously I didn't know the difference between what was great and what wasn't great. But it was an interesting effort. Then there was another book that came out called Spock Messiah that is not very good, but I love the cover. But anyway, so Star Trek novels, in my mind as a child, rightly or wrongly in the 70s, were actual Star Trek, were genuine Star Trek. No one could tell me that they were not canonical. The Gold Key comics I knew were not canonical because, as we found out later, a lot of the artists who drew those comics had never even seen the show before. So that's why you had flames coming out of the hangar deck. But Star Trek novels were near and dear to my heart. And when Star Trek The Motion Picture came out, Bantam lost the rights to Star Trek novels. And they didn't publish very many. I think there was like less than 20. But then Pocket Books picked up the Star Trek franchise. And they put out, Gene Roddenberry actually did write the novelization of Star Trek The Motion Picture, which is wild. If you want to read unfettered Star Trek, uncut Star Trek, read Roddenberry's Star Trek The Motion Picture novelization. It's fascinating. But then they started publishing original novels. Like the first novel that Pocket Books published was The Entropy Effect by Vonda McIntyre, who was a noted science fiction writer in her own right. But anyway, so I started reading the Pocket science fiction novels, and in the early 80s, they were all over the place. They were wild, with varying degrees of quality. But my very favorite of those early science fiction novels was The Wounded Sky by an author named Diane Duane, who actually later went on to write in the first season. They loosely adapted The Wounded Sky for the first season Next Generation episode Where No One Has Gone Before, with the Traveler, that introduced the Traveler. And The Wounded Sky also introduced one of Star Trek's great alien characters, K'tilk, who was a crystalline alien, a female crystalline spider, basically. Great, great book. And she went on to write My Enemy, My Ally, which was a sequel to the Enterprise incident. But I'll tell you a funny story. This is a true story. So when I moved to LA in 1988, Pocket Books published the first Star Trek hardcover novel that they were putting out. And so their first novel came out in 1980. It was The Entropy Effect. So this is 8 years later. And by then they might have put out 50 paperback books. I don't know the actual number. But so Star Trek's first hardcover was coming out from Pocket, really prestigious. And it's called Spock's World. And it had two stories going on. You had the history of Vulcan, and then you had a contemporary story, about what was going on. There was shenanigans happening with Vulcan. Vulcan was going to secede from the Federation. All kinds of craziness was happening. So I get this book, and it's the summer of 1988. And I moved down here with a friend of mine and her boyfriend from college. She was going to Cal Arts, and I was going to USC, and we got this Westwood apartment. So every day I would ride my bike with Allan, her boyfriend, because we had nothing to do. I saved up a bunch of money and chilling out, partying for all the summer of 88. We would ride our bikes down to Palos Verdes. We'd basically ride 36 miles a day. We were just ripped. And we'd come back and then sit on Venice Beach and just hang out. And that's what we did all summer. So I take Spock's World with me, and I was fanatical about the condition of my books, right? So I'm reading Spock's World. And remember, I just turned 21. I was young and pretty and buff and all that, tan, really in great shape. But I'm reading this book, and nothing else matters. I am locked in to reading Spock's World. This is it was like crack cocaine. Just give me more. I couldn't get it in my brain fast enough. So I'm reading it for 2.5 hours. And then this wave, I'm not paying attention to everything. This wave of sand just comes in my face, and it's all in the book. So it gets in the crack of I'm fucking pissed. And I'm looking around going, something has happened. What's going on? I'm looking around going, what? Did somebody fall off a bike? What happened? And I look up, and there is, and we're talking 1988, kind of like Heather Thomas or somebody like that. A total California beauty is standing, and I'm still not quite. And then she's looking right down at me, and she says, she's talking to me now. And I realize she has kicked sand. Literally, if you had old comic books, nerds would get sand kicked in their face, and you'd buy a comic, or you'd sit on the back and then write in, and we'll give you a workout program, and you can get muscles so you won't have sand kicked in your face. I literally had sand kicked in my face by this beautiful blonde. And I'm looking at her, and she says, she's like, and she's hot, but she's fucking pissed. And I'm like, she's like, you are the most stuck up person I've ever come across in my entire life. And I'm like, I don't even know you, bitch. And she's like, I've been trying to get your attention for the last 2 hours, and you haven't even looked up from that book once. Now, that was true. And if I had made eye contact with her, earlier, I certainly would have, made some kind of a play, come up with some interesting pitter-patter. But I was reading Diane Duane's hardcover Star Trek novel, Spock's World. And I don't care how hot you are. You are not more interesting than what T'Pring is doing on the planet Vulcan right now. What her plot was. But how am I going to explain that to some hottie on the beach in 1988? I'm not. So I just took that. I said, I apologize. But you don't know what's happening on the planet Vulcan. And she walks away. Anyway, that was written by Diane Duane. And when I went to Convergence in 2001, a convention in Minneapolis, great fan-run convention. I think it was 2001 or maybe it was 2009. 2008. I went there twice. Maybe it was 2008. I got to sit down with Diane Duane and tell her this story, and she was delighted. So here is an article that Diane Duane herself wrote, and let me make sure that I actually get the right one here, because I want to make sure that. And I thought this was, again, there's a lot of information to know. So this is an article that Diane Duane, the author of My Enemy, My Ally, the author of The Wounded Sky, the author of Spock's World, and the rest of her Rihansu. See, Diane Duane did something really cool. She realized that we call the Romulans Romulans, probably because Romulus and Remus or whatever. But she said the Romulans themselves, they don't call themselves Romulans. They don't know what Rome was. Fucking Nero, you idiots. But what she called the Romulans was the Rihansu. That's what they call themselves. What a great addition to Star Trek canon. But anyway, so here is what Diane Duane wrote. Now, she wrote this. This was on her blog on August 30th, 2022. And she's responding to somebody on her blog asking her. And so let me start. Regarding the business of working with an established franchise. Yep, we've dealt with that here before every now and then, but the tagging has been admittedly uneven, so let me just come at it again. Always adding the note that this is how I did it back in the day, and the methods or pathways of access have changed. So how did I get to be a published Star Trek novelist? I am a first-generation Star Trek fan. I fell in love with Star Trek the Original Series as soon as it premiered, and I immediately started writing fan fiction in that universe. It should be mentioned here that a couple or a few decades before the days of widespread internet connectedness, not only did I have no idea that other people were doing something very similar, but I had no idea it even had a name. I was writing all alone, in a vacuum, with no support whatsoever. But however accidentally I discovered something invaluable, it made me happy. We'll come back to this later. So time went by and I slid from that genre of fanfic writing into writing fiction that was much more Tolkienian in genre, and from there into writing original fiction that Tolkien would have found, well, rather different. Cutting another longish story short, in 1978-79, I sold and I had published my first novel. This one, the initial volume in the LGBTQ and poly-ish Tale of the Five Middle Kingdom series, that would later get me shortlisted 2 years running for the Astounding Award for Best New Writer in the Sci-Fi Fantasy field. Now, when something like this happens to you, it gets a lot easier to pitch new novels to people. I'm not just talking about the increased attention that awards and nominations bring you, but having a traditionally published book out tells other potential publishers that you've mastered at least some important aspects of the novelist business, A, being able to conceive of a plot that will sustain a novel-length work, and B, being able to go from concept to starting in on a novel and being able to finish a novel, C, being able to finish a novel, and D, being able to cope with the editorial process, handling suggested edits, dealing with a copy-edited manuscript, dealing with proofs, etc., etc. As it happens, while I was dealing with the sequel to publishing The Door into Fire, meaning the inevitable question, what are you going to do next, I'd also been doing some typing for an acquaintance who was typewriter challenged. They were writing a Star Trek novel, and I have to say what I was typing up for them was giving me hives. It was not anything like what I thought a Star Trek novel should look like. I remember saying to a friend or two on the quiet, I could eat a ream of I could eat a ream of typing paper and barf a better Star Trek novel than this. And finally, one of them, almost certainly David Gerald, who, God love him, has a history of daring me into doing things I want to do anyway, turned around and called my bluff and said, all right, go on then, quit your kvetching and just go and do it. Which left me staring at the problem with a lot more intent. Fine, you're going to pitch a novel to Trek. What story are you going to tell? It's not like you're constrained by a TV budget here. Stretch out and tell the biggest Star Trek story you can find. One that can only be told, or best told, in this universe. This being my working prime criterion for stories told in other people's universes. For best effect, the story should only be capable of being told within that set of characters and circumstances. The jewel must be to cut to suit the setting, not, however counterintuitive it might seem, not the other way around. So I sat with that concept for a while, and eventually the right idea or set of ideas presented itself. I can vividly remember the moment I was sitting on a bus bench near Victory and White Oak in the San Fernando Valley when the idea hit. It was a long time before cell phones, so I had to wait an hour or so to get home so I could call my agent and say, Don, guess what? I'm going to write a Star Trek novel. There was the briefest pause, after which he said, only half joking, do you have to? Because both of us knew perfectly well that from Paramount's point of view, Star Trek novels were merely another kind of merchandising, like plastic phasers and James T. Kirk action figures. And strictly speaking, regardless of how we love them, they still are. But then Don said, okay, do an outline and we'll see what they think. So I wrote the outline, and my agent sent it along to the editor of the Trek books at Pocket, who was then David Hartwell, God rest him, a fabulous editor of any and all kinds of science fiction. And Dave read it and liked it, and he sent it to Paramount for approval. And they read it and liked it, and gave Dave the go-ahead to buy it. And that turned into The Wounded Sky. There's an overview. She talks about an overview being there. And as a tied for second novel went, was written at very nearly the same time. It doesn't seem to have done too badly. Anyway, after that got written and turned in and published, the people at Pocket, somewhat to my surprise, said to me, okay, well, what have you got for us next? It was that simple, and I was that lucky. I liked working with them. They liked working with me, and they liked what I'd done enough to ask for more. And though I have no data on this, I strongly suspect the first book sold well. The reason it sold well, because it's an excellent Star Trek story, and it's an even more compelling science fiction story. So Diane Duane's The Wounded Sky is one of my favorite Star Trek novels of all time. It's an early Star Trek novel, so they have evolved, but it is an incredible Star Trek novel, and I highly recommend it. As a matter of fact, I highly recommend any of the writing staff to read The Wounded Sky. They probably, as a matter of fact, I can tell you that they probably haven't read any Star Trek novels, much less the best ones. I'll tell you another story. This is true. There is a studio president, I won't say which one, a studio president that runs a major motion picture studio who has read a lot of Star Trek novels. Not kidding. Not going to out him, but so you know it's a him. But somebody who runs a major motion picture studio. I'm just saying. So that's how I did it. Everybody else's mileage will inevitably vary, but I don't think there's going to be much argument with the idea that before working with other IP holders in their worlds, you might usefully first do as much work as possible in your own. That way, potential publishing partners will have something to help get them a sense of what your voice sounds like outside of someone else's world. Now, as for working with someone else's IP, anyone's, this is how I manage it. Now remember, you're going to hark back to the earlier article I read. A, remember the IP is theirs. They were there before you arrived and will doubtless be there for long after you're gone. They own that property, are likely enough to have worked hard on it in their time, and whether they originated it or are just buyers are almost certainly powerfully protective of it, except the people that they've hired to make Star Trek since 2009. J.J. Abrams says, I never liked Star Trek. Alex Kurtzman had never seen a Star Trek episode before he co-wrote Star Trek 09 and Into Darkness. And you can tell. Do your homework. Know your licensor. Know their history with other creators. Find out where there have been problems in the past, and keep your eyes open for warning signs that you may be about to discover some new one. If you were lucky enough to be invited in, act like a considerate house guest, creatively speaking. While working in that universe, don't, for example, sneakily attempt to jettison parts of the property that annoy you, or covertly subvert bits that seem to call for subversion. Overt subversion is a different story. Be in communication with your IP owner about this, and you may be able to win them over, though you should be prepared for them to take credit for this after the fact. But I've seen people disinvited from franchises with extreme prejudice after they were caught trying to pull one or another kind of fast one on their publisher. If there's a work with us guide or in-house Bible, sleep with it under your pillow. B. Know your subject and universe. Know it. It is an absolute certainty that no matter how well you think you know it, there are fans out there who know it better than you do, massively, obsessively, eat, drink, and sleep better. And if you put a wrong foot out, they will come for you. Leaving aside the issue of not wanting to be left looking like an idiot on the internet, you ought to, in any case, be deeply cognizant of your host's world's internal verities before you can expect to write it flexibly and well. And add to this, know your characters' voices, not just the way they phrase things, but the way they think about things, and possibly more importantly, feel about things. It's not you, the readers, will have come for, it's them. You must channel the core characters at very least authentically and ideally affectionately, or it'll all end in tears. By the way, I love that album on 4AD. For the duration of this work, you're in service to them. Treat them courteously and give them your best words to speak, but always in their own voices. Don't be afraid to let them be more real than you are. Well, that's a problem. For a lot of people, unquestionably, they are. If that's a problem for you, you shouldn't be doing this kind of work, at least not more than once. Don't do it for money, don't do it for fame, do it for love, or not at all. Let's be realistic. Any licensing IP is likely to, in the grand scheme of things, be far better and more widely known than you are. You may acquire some positive press for your work with it, but in many people's minds, the positivity will have far more to do with the property than with you, regardless of your gifts or how much you love that universe or whether or not you came up through the fandom. This is a big point. None of the people working on Star Trek currently, they know it's not about them. They're not going to be creating Breaking fucking Bad or Better Call Saul, and that's a problem. That's a problem. They're slumming. They're slumming. They don't care what TV show they're working on. They just want a fucking paycheck. Star Trek might as well be the goddamn Magicians, and for some, it is. There's no difference, which is a problem when it comes to something like Star Trek. You know, what you want is you want the Tony Gilroys of the world that might not know Star Trek, but make it their life's ambition to come in and make something great, like Nicholas Meyer did with Star Trek The Wrath of Khan, like Eric Jedrinson did with his Star Trek The Beginning script that was commissioned by Carey McCluggag's time at Paramount. Right after Enterprise went off the air, Eric Jedrinson came in as the supervising producer of Band of Brothers, was tasked with writing a Star Trek movie script, and he wrote Star Trek The Beginning, as he called it, The Iliad. Honest to God, listen to the interview he did with the Inglorious Trexperts. Eric Jedrinson wrote a great Star Trek movie, which, by the way, checks every fucking box that Paramount wants from a Star Trek movie that they already own. And you know what? It does everything they want. And you've got Eric Jedrinson, who co-wrote the last Mission Impossible movies. If anybody was smart, they would go get Eric Jedrinson and they'd get Chris McQuarrie and go, hey guys, we want you to make $100 million. You get no more than $100 million. We want you to take your Star Trek The Beginning movie script. You guys do a rewrite together, expand it. You keep the same core idea, which introduces characters getting out of Starfleet Academy and the beginning of the Romulan War, and it's in canon with the end of Enterprise. Go do that, Star Trek. Go do that, and cap it at $100 million. Either make it theatrically or put it on goddamn streaming. But that's what you should do. Developing all this bullshit you've been developing, your own Star Trek The Beginning script that they want to make, no. No, no, no. Bad Paramount. Bad Skydance. Go get Eric Jedrinson's script, pull it out of mothballs, and go make that. He has to do a rewrite, but get him and McQuarrie to do it. You know, don't make it take a year to make. Go in there and make it like a TV show. Do what they did with Harv Bennett making Star Trek 2. Think about it as a TV movie. You release it theatrically when it turns out to be great. That's what you should do. Go do that. Anyway. As regards to money, some licensed work will pay competitively with original work done in the same genre, but most will not. Not even being a hot name with a given IP will necessarily guarantee you any kind of serious money. In particular, IP licensors, remember, she's talking about writing novels, but anyway, it's still valid. In particular, IP licensors have a historical tendency to pay lower than normally accepted royalty rates, and in the past, it has taken very energetic and insistent agents to break them of this habit, if even only on a temporary and on a case-by-case basis. It therefore stands to reason that for the sake of your own best functioning as a writer, you need to be doing work of this kind because you really need to do it or have to do it to make yourself happy, to scratch a creative itch, or to give something back to a property or universe that you love. Now, I'm not naive. I know that people who work in TV, any job you're going to take it. Not everybody gets an opportunity like Terry Matalas did to do Star Trek Picard Season 3. He was still saddled with the gobbledygook that was Picard Seasons 1 and 2, but he came back and he did what he wanted. He brought back the Next Generation characters and gave them a terrific send-off. He also planted the seed for Star Trek Legacy or Star Trek, whatever you want to call it. You know, I would have called it something else, but it's teed up. They did nothing with that. Why are we getting a Starfleet Academy show? Nobody wants that. Why do you want to watch a Star Trek show about people that aren't in space yet? And I know that half Starfleet Academy is a ship, so it comes and goes. That's the dumbest idea ever, by the way. You literally have part of your university that's also a ship, so you have to watch it take off all the time? Wouldn't you have it in geosynchronous orbit and people would just beam up? Especially because it's the 31st century? Why would you do that? What a dumb idea. Who thought of that? Fucking idiot. Anyway, I'm just saying. Am I bitter? No. But it's a dumb idea. Half your university is actually a spaceship. So does that mean you get to dramatically show, so you've built in an expensive effect sequence whenever you show the ship take off? What a weird thing to do. Why not just, it's the 31st century. Better yet, why not have a space elevator at Starfleet Academy? Do something cool. So weird. Finally, this may sound heretical, but I don't believe that a licensed work is necessarily most fruitfully viewed as a natural stepping stone to doing original work, or even to becoming a licensor yourself, although that does happen. I think that well and thoughtfully handled at both ends of things, the auctorial as well as the editorial, not your own IP work can be entirely worth doing wholly for its own sake. To write for the enjoyment of readers or viewers who are using licensed work to scratch the same itch or feed the same passion that fanfic writers or writers know of, just wanting more good story in that universe, that's an entirely honorable employment in my book. You are an entertainer. Entertain and fear nothing. Well, that's from Diane Duane. And I wish that the writers of current Star Trek would take her advice to heart. But if nothing else, if you're a Star Trek fan, especially a classic Star Trek fan, her books, The Wounded Sky, which is totally original, My Enemy, My Ally, is an extension of the third season original series episode, The Enterprise Incident. And then Spock's World deals with the history of Vulcan. I mean, you know what? You'll go read. Here's an exercise. And I would, because even if you don't know anything about, or you're not somebody who knows the original series backwards and forwards, Spock's World's a really interesting book because it delves into the history of Vulcan. There's more creativity in the pages of that book in terms of extending what the Star Trek universe is all about than anything we've received from Star Trek since 2009. And, you know, I talked to Bob Orsi once about this. I was at a wedding that he was at, and we talked a lot about that. The Reeve Stevens, Judith and Garfield Reeve Stevens, who are people that also I think are great Star Trek novelists. If you read their novel Federation, start with Prime Directive, but read their novel Federation, those two books have more interesting things, more interesting ideas about the Star Trek universe than ever. I mean, frankly, if you were going to go back and make a Star Trek movie, Skydance, I would go adapt the Reeve Stevens book Prime Directive with your original cast. Chekhov, unfortunately, can't be in it. But Prime Directive, I've never understood how come these IPs, whether it's Predator, whether it's Alien, whether it's Star Trek or Star Wars, they adapt books all the time. Yet this fiction, Star Trek fan fiction that is produced professionally, they never look at it in terms of I mean, they've ripped off Dorothy Fontana's Star Trek novel, Vulcan's Glory, for Una's backstory in Strange New Worlds. More thievery going on, but they've really never looked at Star Trek novels. The Dark Horse comics have better ideas about the Star Wars, the Predator, and the Alien universes than we've ever seen. Even, I'm enjoying Alien Earth, but they've done so many more interesting things in the pages of those comics. As we talk about, the Thrawn trilogy was being published concurrently with the Dark Empire comic series. That Hot Toys, hopefully they'll ship me my Dark Empire Luke at some point. But why don't the movie companies go mine this stuff? These articles, these books and these comics were written by people that live and breathe these franchises. They've spent way longer thinking about Star Trek than any of these assholes currently writing Strange New Worlds. They're all original stories, and if they are adding or we're revisiting characters, Peter David's book, the idea of tying Q and Trelane together in Strange New Worlds, which I bet they think they're so clever, Peter David did that in a Star Trek hardcover decades ago and did it way better. Why not go delve into that? It's right there for you. You can steal it because Paramount already owns it. You steal everything else. You steal things that Paramount doesn't even own. Again, Ursula K. Le Guin. Ripped off proudly, says Alex Kurtzman. Yes, we were very inspired by Ursula K. Le Guin. He said that in an interview. Does she get credit for that story in the first season of Strange New Worlds? No. But they've got all these other great stories that should be delved into. Anyway, I got a few more letters I think I can read. Should I read some letters? Do you want to hear some letters? I got one. Chris Wolf wrote me a letter. He says, "Greetings, Mr. Burnett. I'm a 62-year-old retired electrician. I grew up watching the original series of Star Trek, and I found the novels, waited online in Paramus, New Jersey, to watch Star Trek the Motion Picture. I was referred to as a Trekkie by my dad and didn't like it. Then I would kill to hear it today. In 2008, I went to the Star Trek convention in Vegas, and I bought the Admiral's package. The idea of a prequel intrigued me. Enterprise started out flawed from episode 1. Too far, too fast. In my mind canon, the episode where No Man Has Gone Before provided the best prequel sci-fi opportunity. You have an early spacecraft in deep space that is unheard of until the black box was found by Kirk and crew. Any stories could have been told with no chance of ever bumping into canon issues. Instead, we got TOS Light with Strange New Worlds. In Balance of Terror, we are told pre-Romulan war vessels were not NX-01 level tech. The Pilgrim, from where no man has gone before, could have been an NX type ship because it vanished, so we never saw it. And their discovery. I wanted to like Strange New Worlds, but it's nothing like any Trek I enjoy. Sure, it has the best special effects and costumes and sets, but it has no writing. Thank you for the listen, Christopher Trek Wolf Shire." Well, Christopher, thank you for writing in. I appreciate that. A really interesting letter. Joe DePalma writes in, "Star Trek Rant in your episode 1051. Wow, thank you for this episode and this much-needed Star Trek rant about New Trek and Strange New Worlds. I'm not sure I realized how much I needed to hear this until you so clearly spelled it out. You and I are the same age. I was born in 1967, and I come from the same era of fandom. I share so many of the same memories and experiences of growing up with Star Trek as you do. We definitely park our shuttles in the same shuttle bay, so maybe this really isn't a surprise. I want Star Trek to succeed and continue to grow as much as any lifelong fan. I'm truly happy that we're getting new Star Trek at all. I want so badly to like these new iterations of Star Trek. I long for the days of the thought-provoking Star Trek I had as a child and later on as a young adult in the 90s. I feel like your rant was a splash of cold water in my face, yelling, "Wake up! You know Star Trek is better than this. This is why you love it 50 years later. Do not lower your standards. Expect more from Star Trek." Especially as we're living in an absolute golden age of television. I love the cast of Strange New Worlds and the original concept of the show. I've tried to keep an open mind and give it the benefit of the doubt. I think I've even been lying to myself that it's not that bad, even though deep down I know it's not good. 4.5 Vulcans was too far. I could never put it into words as eloquently as you have, so thank you for carrying the torch on this and speaking out. I love this channel and keep up the great work. Thank you, Joe DePalma. Well, Joe, thanks for the kind words. I appreciate that. Yeah, Star Trek has meant so much to me in my own life because as I've grown up, and I've said this a million times, so many times on this channel, but I'll just say it one more time on Star Trek's birthday. As I grew, the Star Trek franchise grew and evolved. I started watching Star Trek as a little kid. There was only the 3 seasons. Then there was the animated series, 73 and 74. At the same time, there was the animated series for Planet of the Apes. So I was seeing these franchises. It was really interesting. And then you got a Planet of the Apes TV series, and then Star Trek the Motion Picture came out. So 73, 74, 79, Star Trek the Motion Picture came out. 82, Star Trek the Wrath of Khan. 84, Search for Spock. 86, Voyage Home. 87, Next Generation came out. So Star Trek was evolving. As I went off to college, Star Trek The Next Generation took me through college. I got out of college, Deep Space Nine debuted. I was a young adult in LA in the 90s. Then I actually started working for different companies, and I was hired as a Star Trek consultant right after Voyager came out. I was being paid as a Star Trek consultant in the 90s. Voyager came out, what took us into the 2000s. 2001, Enterprise came out. But everything that was happening, Star Trek was evolving. We got new characters. Some were more effective than others, but the Star Trek franchise was being taken into different directions. It was still growing and evolving. Then in 2009, something strange happened. They decided to reboot Star Trek and bring back Kirk and Spock. But the interesting thing for anybody who is a fan of the show is that Kirk and Spock had been growing and evolving since 1966. So if you watch Star Trek or you're a Star Trek fan, you could watch Kirk go from 1966 to when he died in Generations in 1994, and then the character of Spock went all the way up through the J.J. Abrams films. So it was sort of weird to be asked, and then you had the new portrayals of, and I understand you can reboot things, but Star Trek was interesting in the sense that as a pop culture entertainment, we lived and grew up with these characters as they grew old and literally died in canon. Dr. McCoy didn't die. He showed up in Next Generation and encountered Farpoint. Sarek was still alive. Spock was still alive. We got to see these characters literally in canon leap 100 years into the future. So when Star Trek decided to, let's go back and do a Star Trek movie directed by a man, a self-professed not a fan of Star Trek, when you watch Star Trek 09, it's like, oh, you don't really want to make a Star Trek movie. You want to make a Star Wars movie. Well, it didn't work. The 3 J.J. Abrams Star Trek movies did not make the money justifying what they spent on them. Star Trek Beyond didn't make much money at all. And so you're wondering, well, what do they hope to do? And in 2017, when Discovery, by the way, a bastardized version of what Brian Fuller created. By the way, original Star Trek Discovery creator Brian Fuller, today, his film, I think it was tonight, was playing at TIFF. He's made his directorial debut with the movie Dust Bunny starring Mads Mikkelsen. I mean, if you want to know, the man who created Star Trek Discovery created Hannibal, which is one of the greatest horror TV shows ever. And if you want to see something ironic, so basically Alex Kurtzman usurps Star Trek Discovery from Brian Fuller and Nicholas Meyer. They get dismissed. And then Alex Kurtzman goes and gets the rights that Brian Fuller couldn't get to Silence of the Lambs and does a really fucking shitty show based on Silence of the Lambs and destroyed the very thing that Brian Fuller was trying to do, a 4th season of Hannibal. What a douche. I mean, the 3 seasons of Hannibal are one of the greatest reimaginings of a mythology we'd seen in other forms already. And then everyone knows that Brian Fuller was trying to get the rights to Silence of the Lambs so they could do Hannibal season 4. That was his dream, Ray Kinsella. And what did Alex Kurtzman do? He gets the rights to that, and then they go make Clarice. That was the worst TV pilot I've ever read. And I've read a lot of TV pilots. It was fucking terrible. And you're like, this asshole stopped. And whether it's true or not that Brian could have gotten the rights to Silence of the Lambs to make... Do you think the guy who made Hannibal would have done a better job with Clarice, or the guy who made Star Trek Discovery? I don't know. But Clarice didn't make it through 1 season without getting canceled because it was fucking awful. And we lost a 4th season of Hannibal because of it. But that's okay. We have Brian Fuller, who made a theatrically released film coming out from Lionsgate, whereas Alex Kurtzman directed The Mummy. There is karma. There is justice in the universe. Just free Star Trek from the hostage crisis that's been happening to that franchise since 2009. Free it! So, yeah. Anyway, I could rant and rave. I'm going to get out. I've overstayed my welcome already. I want to... Oh, wait. Let me check and see if anybody has thrown in more super chats or things like that. Tornawatt Studios says, we need Gateway by Frederick Pohl as a series. Hey, the fact that we got a Foundation series, you never know. Gateway was one of the very first books I ever got from the Science Fiction Book Club. I'm talking about the Science Fiction Book Club a lot, with a great painting. I believe John Berkey painted the cover of that with the ship coming out, the original cover. Friend of the channel, Mr. Z. Mr. Z celebrates 14 months of membership. Space escalators at Starfleet Academy. Love you, Rob. Yeah, well, it's better than half of the Starfleet Academy is a ship, and so it takes off. I mean, that's another thing. It's like, it's cooler that ships are in orbit. It's dumb that half of Starfleet Academy keeps taking off so we can go into space. The classroom is the starship. Okay. 1001 Johnny says, rest in peace, Peter David. It's true. B Things says, Star Trek as a brand once indicated smart, entertaining storytelling. Now the brand is tarnished and can't be trusted to not have ricin in it. It's true. It's true. I don't know about the ricin part, but it's not good. As a matter of fact, it's really not good. So I don't know what to say. But anyway, I'm going to end this Star Trek birthday show. I want to thank you all for once again coming on this journey. I know I'm like a broken record. I know. I can't help it. You know, I sit in this. There's so many Star Trek things in this Robservatory, things that I love so much. And I've loved Star Trek my whole life, and I've worked on it professionally. I've made a feature film with William Shatner about my obsession with Star Trek. I was a Star Trek consultant. I just want Star Trek to be good because I think our timeline needs Star Trek again. Star Trek should be... Remember, 94 was on the cover of Time magazine. Picard and Kirk were on the cover of Time. Star Trek, I don't think, was ever bigger than it was in 94. Next Generation went off the air with All Good Things. Generations, as much as I have problems with the film, came out. It was a big deal combining the two generations. Big deal. Deep Space Nine was on the air. Next Generation went off the air. Voyager was getting prepped. We will never see those days again because Star Trek is no longer telling stories that have any relevance to anybody in the audience. All it is it's a confection. You know, it's the Vegas show version of Star Trek. It's not good. The writing deserves better. We need people that read books, that have read science fiction novels, or at least read the best Star Trek novels. I guarantee you, any writer that reads The Wounded Sky would suddenly rethink what they've been doing on Star Trek Strange New Worlds and be like, wow, we could really be telling some really interesting stories. But they won't. They won't do the work. Diane Duane says that you have to do the work, but they don't. Anyway, I want to thank everybody that generously supports this channel via Super Chats and Tips. I promise I'm going to get back to talking about something other than Star Trek. I promise. Star Trek's birthday has come and gone. We're going to get a time travel story for the 10th episode of Strange New Worlds this week. I'm sure it's going to be startlingly original and make us all feel like we felt when we watched yesterday's Enterprise for the first time. I can't wait. I'm sure it's going to have a scintillating title. No, I'm not. Anyway, I want to thank everybody. I want to thank my moderating staff. I want to thank Tom Jr. Jackson. I want to thank Darth Plato. I want to thank everybody that sticks around on this channel. We're going to have some fun. By the way, I'm doing an interview tomorrow with somebody that I wanted to do an interview with for a long time. I would say one of the best producers in Hollywood working today. That is one of the more unsung producers. Somebody I've talked about a lot on this channel, but I'm going into Hollywood and I'm interviewing him in a studio tomorrow. And you will see that interview because he has a movie coming out this week. So anyway, I will talk with you about that later. It's going to be very exciting, and I promise no mention of Star Trek will be made in the interview. So, on that note, remember, every person you meet has a story to tell that you have yet to hear. And all you have to do is listen. And with that, I say to all of you, have a better night, and of course, live long and prosper. Of course, I shall do neither, because they've killed my favorite show. And on that note,